practice of reading books, I read several books concurrently. The reason why is because I like to enjoy a encapsulation of literature throughout history, or history through literature. Doesn't matter why. I'm just here to tell you what it is that I do. I start with a book like this one, Cymbeline, written by William Shakespeare. I read this one first, one chapter or one act or one scene, whatever's convenient for me, and then I set it aside and I go to the next one. This is by Suetonius. This is Senorita. I don't know if you can see her. She'll be up here on the table shortly. Suetonius wrote 12 Caesars. He wrote it in ancient Roman times, and it was about ancient Roman Caesars. The major ones like Julius and Augustus and Tiberius and Marcus Aurelius and Claudius and Caligula. Right now I'm reading about Nero. And so I put this one on hold for a little while. The better to read Quo Vadis, which is very much about Nero. It's by Henryk Sienkiewicz. I think that's how they pronounced it in Rome. Anyway, I move on to something more recent, but not much more recent. This is The Idylls of the King by Sir Lord Alfred Tennyson. Alfred Lord Tennyson. And it's poetic, it's like epic poetry. And it's about Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere. And the Arthurian legend happens to be my, I guess, favorite story. And I say that because the plot is not basic. It's more sophisticated. So in other words, when I say a basic plot, you take a Western. There's the guy with the white hat. He's the good guy. And there's a guy wearing a black hat. And he's what? He's the bad guy. That's basic, right? Well, with the Arthurian legend, you have characters like Guinevere and Lancelot and Arthur and Merlin and Nimue and Morgana Le Fay, and they're not very good and they're not very bad. They're sympathetic characters who have character flaws, and that's what makes it sophisticated. Senorita Magdalena Marseille is her whole name. She's 19 years old and is not getting enough attention right now. So that's obligatory. When you do a video about books and literature, you need to have a cat show up unexpectedly, and you have to act all surprised and hopefully get extra likes because of the adorability of said cat. Next, I move up quite a long ways to the 1700s. Now, this one is wrapped in plastic because I haven't opened it, but I am reading Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone by Diana Gabaldon. I'm reading it on Kindle. I would never read a book like this. This is like a collector's edition. So we're trying to keep it in relatively pristine condition, right? Next, we go to the 1815 era in Europe. This is also a book that I'm not reading this copy, The Charterhouse of Parma by, I will pronounce it Stendhal, but I'm sure I'm saying his last name wrong. So this is right around Waterloo is when it begins, the demise of Napoleon. And there's some romance in it. I don't love it, but I am reading it in conjunction with two other books that began also in 1815. The first, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Now I'm reading this for the second time. The first time I didn't love it. I knew how I thought the story should go based on movies that I had seen and illustrated classics I had read as a kid. And so this is like a 1,400 page book, and it doesn't take 1,400 pages to tell the story in the movie or to tell the story in the illustrated classics. There's a lot more packed into this, and I didn't care for it. It didn't belong there. based on what I was expecting to read the first time through. But I gave it another try because some people consider it the best novel of all time, right? And I heard that enough to the point where I was like, let me give it another try. And this time I'm reading it for what's in the book and not for what I expected to be in the book. And there's a difference, and I am enjoying it more. Same can be said for this, another 1,400 page book, another book translated from French into English. This is Les Miserables, also begins in 1815, around the time of Waterloo. I did not care for this one the first time, not so much because there was a lot of extraneous plot added in, but in this case, because there's a reliance on coincidence that offends me. I feel like a story shouldn't have that much coincidence in it to make it enjoyable. But I am enjoying it much more the second time, paying closer attention to characters like Monsieur Bienvenido, who's like the great priest who kind of motivates Jean Van, the main character, to change his ways. Moving up more than a decade now, this is around 1827. This is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I'd never read anything by Anne Bronte previously. I had read Wuthering Heights by her sister and Jane Eyre by her other sister. But I actually enjoy this one more so far because it's more realistic. The characters are not quite so fantastic. Their emotions aren't quite so fantastic. Anne Bronte also wrote Agnes Grey. And so that's on my TBR list. TBR means to be read. I will read it probably sometime in the next 5 years, Lord willing. This one, we're going to be moving up to the 1830s, I think. This is translated from the French, Old Man Goriot, also titled, sometimes translated Père Goriot, which means Father Goriot, or sometimes just merely Goriot. This is an interesting book. He's a vermicelli producer, and he made a fortune, and he's got a couple of daughters, and they mean more to him than anything, but they have distanced themselves from him, I guess, purportedly because it was advisable for them to do so based on the circle in society that they wanted to move up into. James by Percival Everett. This won the National Book Award. James is a more proper name for Jim, the fictitious friend of Huckleberry Finn. So this is kind of the Huckleberry Finn story, but it's just from the perspective of Jim. So in this case, it's Jim's story. This is nonfiction. It's book 3, a 3-book set called The Civil War, A Narrative by Sidney Sheldon. Nope, not Sidney Sheldon, Shelby Foote. Damn it. I put these next ones on hold because I wanted to kind of coordinate where I was with my Civil War and post-Civil War literature. So this is Gray Fox. It's about Robert E. Lee, also nonfiction. I started reading this because when I was a kid, there was a student who in elementary school who had this book in his house. And I kind of felt inferior because he was reading books like this, very serious, when we were kids. And I wasn't. I was reading illustrated classics and so forth. So I'm just kind of making up for that finally. Another one on hold. The Army of the Potomac, A Stillness at Appomattox by Bruce Catton. My dad had this trilogy when I was a kid, and I consider myself a Civil War buff, and so I wanted to read this trilogy. This is book 3, and it's on hold right now. Also on hold is The Forge by T.S. Stribling. I intend to read the sequel, which is called The Store, and that one won the Pulitzer Prize. But I wanted to read this one first. I put it on hold again to get my Civil War literature coordinated before I return to it. This is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown, nonfiction. It kind of explores sort of the horrific attitudes that white people have taken towards Native Americans in this country throughout history. Not just the attitudes, but also the massacres perpetrated against Native Americans, the tragedies. And so this is not light reading, this is heavy. But on hold as I coordinate my Civil War history and my post-Civil War history. This is the last one that's on hold. This is the sequel to Gone with the Wind. It's called Scarlet. And so the setting is, I think, maybe late 1870s right now. I'm just waiting until I have some other books catch up to it before I move on. 1870s, this is Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now. This is the first book I've read by Anthony Trollope. He also wrote Barchester Towers and a lot of other books. And I've heard that they're great. And this first one that I've started in on is very interesting. Main character is a mother of two, a widow, and she wants to start a writing career. Her son is maybe more of a main character than she is, and he's problematic because he squanders money recklessly, and he's hurting not just himself, but his sister and his mother because of his gambling vice. Now we're around 1900. Henry James, The Wings of the Dove. This is cerebral reading. What I mean by that is that the characters may not be doing very much, but there's a lot going on in their heads. And Henry James takes a lot of words to explain every single thought that they have. And the more words he uses, the less I understand what he's talking about. So that is not a glowing review. But when I don't enjoy a book, I don't blame the author. I blame myself for not doing the necessary preparatory research. In other words, if I were taking a class about Henry James and reading this book, I might enjoy it more. Probably would. I do like William Faulkner. He does the same thing in terms of cerebral writing, and you can get lost when trying to understand what he's saying. But this is a pretty easy one to understand, The Hamlet. It's book one in the Snopes trilogy. William Faulkner is tied with Thomas Hardy as my favorite author. I'll just say that. This is Ray Bradbury's Dandelion Wine. I don't know what the name of the show was or the movie that my wife and I were watching, and there were a couple of books that came up, 2 or 3 books, and Dandelion Wine was one of them. One thing I find unacceptable is when there's a book referenced in a movie or a show that I haven't read. It does happen sometimes, and so I'm trying to mend that now, or remedy it. This one I'm reading for a book club. This is Giovanni's Room, set in the 1950s in Paris. And this is a homosexual fellow who's discovering his homosexuality. And I think in that time and in that place, homosexuality could be dangerous because homosexuals were mistreated routinely. So you can tell from the very beginning of this book that it's going to be tragic. And nothing I've read so far leads me to believe otherwise. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, my sister, who shall remain unnamed because for all I know, she'd like her identity protected as well. This is kind of a a remake of a classic novel that I won't identify here because that would qualify as something of a spoiler if I did. You could tell a lot about what's going to happen if you know which book this is a remake of. So, but the name of this is Demon Copperhead. And it's interesting so far. Nonfiction now. This is South to America. Now, why am I reading South to America? I watched a YouTube video. It's kind of a self-improvement YouTube video, and it strongly advised viewers to read books. Well, I do. That's what this is about, is I read a lot of books. But I hadn't read a lot of nonfiction. And so the point that this video made by, I think, the Savage narrator is that if somebody takes 14 years or 38 years of their life to research something and they pack all the knowledge that they get from that into a book this size, it behooves us to read it and learn so much so quickly that it took them almost their whole adult life to learn and discover. So here's another one for the same reason, Heavy by Keith Lamont. This is a young man of color growing up in the South, and he tells it like it is, and sometimes it's raw and uncomfortable. Another one for the same reason, nonfiction, Factfulness. This book gets into how we perceive the world based too much, I think, on media and how they portray the world, and not enough on fact. So in other words, we assume that poverty levels are much higher than they really are, that illiteracy is much worse than it really is. Well, these things there are great improvements happening in the world for various reasons. We might be unaware of the improvements because we're basing our perceptions on what we see on a screen instead of the facts that we can read about and study. Also, nonfiction. This is Quiet by Susan Cain. And she gets into why it is that the world is kind of served on a platter to extroverts, whereas introverts have more of a struggle, even though they may have abilities that are as important and sometimes more important than those possessed by extroverts. So this is a thought-provoking book, and that's a good thing when you're reading. Finally, Wool. Now, this is science fiction, and it's by Hugh Howey, and I became aware of it because of the TV show Silo, which I only watched part of the first season before we changed subscriptions and streaming services and whatnot. But it is a really good and very original story that I recommend. That's all I have for you today. If you had any sort of feeling whatsoever about this presentation, there is a like option, and that like covers all different kinds of reactions. So even if you hated this, you could go ahead and hit the thumbs up or whatever. Thank you for your time. Yeah.